In the Apostles' Creed, there's a word that, if we're paying attention, should cause us to really slow down and consider, if not flat out just stop and think, hang on a minute, how does that work? And the word is suffered. We talk about how Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. Now, on the surface of that word, there's immediate agreement. Did Jesus suffer under Pontius Pilate, with his scourges, with the torture, with the crucifixion itself? The answer would be a resounding yes. If you look at the series of events and the pain incurred through it all, that is the pure definition of suffering. But then you take a step back and you think about it theologically. You have to ask the question, well, how does God suffer? Because if God is God, then is suffering real? Can God actually suffer the way we do as human beings? Barth's dialectic theology starts from above. It starts with the otherness, the transcendence of God, the separateness, the solitariness of God, in which God's life is infinite and eternal and comprehensively plenty, fountainous in every way. Contrary to that, our lives are very local, very temporary, very contingent, and they're not plentiful, right? We're constantly needing filled and fueled and cared for. We need other things to keep us alive, whereas God doesn't. So, how can we say then that Jesus, who is God, suffers? Because to suffer is to be deprived of the good. It is to be deprived of peace. It's to be deprived of love and life and the comfort and the graces and the good things that we all enjoy. By definition, the deprivation of those things is a form of suffering. Pain is a deprivation of your body being peaceful. Hunger is a deprivation of food. Loneliness is a deprivation of relationship and community. So, can we honestly say that God is deprived or can be deprived of anything if God's life is infinite and eternal? Well, this is where we reach the paradox. The paradox of the transcendent, infinite, eternal God actually suffering at the hands of other human beings. How does this work? Well, it's still a deep mystery and it's still a paradox, but there's two things that I think can help us see it a little bit more clearly. One is that I believe, my convictions, and this would go along with what you would consider historic Orthodox Christian theology, is that God is immutable. God cannot change. Ontologically, whatever God is that to the absolute, full, infinite, eternal zenith of his being. The gracious plenitude of every attribute, every aspect, every energy of God's life is forever and always realized. That creation cannot act against God in a way that deprives God of anything. We cannot diminish God to be smaller or less than he is. We cannot somehow subtract from God anything of God's life, because God is transcendent and other and whole, and therefore beyond our tampering. So God is immutable. God cannot change. And yet we're told in Scripture and in agreed upon Christian doctrine, like the Apostles' Creed, that Jesus suffers. God, the man, suffers. So, can God truly suffer whilst at the same time being beyond suffering? Well, the answer is a mysterious, but I think a comprehensive yes. That God suffers as a man. The Logos, the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, becomes a human being. The human being Jesus of Nazareth, a historic person in a historic place at a particular time. The events of the Gospel lead him to be brought to the hands of Pontius Pilate, who turns him over to the soldiers and the executioners, whereupon he truly and absolutely and comprehensively suffers. So God suffers as a man, and in his humanity he suffers, and God knows that suffering, And you could say that the one who is immutable experiences pain. And yet, within experiencing that pain, somehow God ontologically still remains unchanged. Here we get into some pretty challenging theological water, because immediately we need to acknowledge Jesus has a divine nature and a human nature that are brought together perfectly within the humanity of the person of Jesus. And the thing you could say is that natures don't suffer. I've got a human nature, but my human nature doesn't suffer if I'm in pain. I suffer as a person because I'm in pain. Jesus suffered as a person, and his personhood was both divine and human. So it can be said that God suffers as a man in man, and yet within his divinity remains transcendent and other, whilst at the same time being omniscient, in other words, knowing all that there is to know. So God knows pain through and through. He knows what pain is and how it works. So this truly allows God to experience what we call pathos in our suffering, and yet remaining fully divine and immutable. So I don't think we'll ever plumb the depth of that mystery, and that's okay, because that allows for the beauty of the gospel to keep us on our toes, and it allows the divine grandeur of God to be beyond explanation, which is appropriate. If there is an answer, though, it would be found in Jesus, the God-man, the incarnation, the full revelation of God to us in human flesh, who does suffer under Pontius Pilate and yet remains fully God. Because one of the things that we have to remember is that his suffering was voluntary. He says, "Nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down, I give it." So even the most terrible vision of pain that history has ever seen was on God's terms. Somehow he walked into that, and yet it wasn't that the world was winning, it's that he was giving. Okay, plenty to ponder there. Until next time, peace.